Baby found 7. German shepherds. Caught in collapsed bounce house. What he did next left everyone in tears. The sky turned the color of an old bruise that Saturday afternoon. Purple-black clouds rolling in from the west, like something alive and hungry. At Riverside Park, the annual community festival was in full swing, children's laughter mixing with carnival music, the smell of funnel cakes and popcorn drifting on air that had suddenly gone still and heavy. 3-year-old Liam Chen stood at the edge of the massive inflatable castle, his small hand gripping his mother, Sarah's fingers so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The bounce house towered above him, a garish purple and pink structure the size of a small building, swaying slightly in wind gusts that had appeared from nowhere. Inside, children bounced and shrieked, their voices echoing off the vinyl walls. But Liam wasn't watching the children. His dark eyes were fixed on something else, something only he seemed to notice. The way the massive structure shuddered with each gust, the way the anchors strained against the ground, the way the whole thing seemed to be breathing, like a living creature preparing to take flight. Sarah felt her son's grip tighten further, felt the tremor running through his small body. "Liam, honey, do you want to go inside? You love bounce houses." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true anymore. Liam hadn't loved much of anything since his father left 6 months ago. The divorce had stolen something from her son, stolen his voice mostly. He'd gone from a chattering, laughing 3-year-old to a silent shadow who communicated in gestures and drawings, who watched the world with eyes that seemed too old, too knowing, too sad for such a small face. The child psychologist said it was selective mutism, a trauma response. "Give him time," she'd said. "He'll talk again when he feels safe." But 6 months had passed, and Liam's small voice remained locked somewhere inside him, trapped like everything else he couldn't express. The festival coordinator's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, urgent now. "Attention all guests, we have a severe weather warning. Please evacuate the bounce house immediately and proceed to your vehicles in an orderly fashion." Parents were already moving, grabbing children, gathering belongings. The wind picked up suddenly, violently, and the bounce house lurched. Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Come on, baby, we need to go." She tugged Liam's hand, but he wouldn't move. His small body had gone rigid, his eyes still fixed on the swaying structure. And then he did something he hadn't done in months. He made a sound. Not words, but a low, keening whimper that raised every hair on Sarah's arms. "Where are you watching from? And if you have a pet, what's their name? Share in the comments below. We love hearing your stories." The storm hit with zero warning, the way Midwest storms sometimes do, going from threatening to catastrophic in seconds. The wind roared in like a freight train, 60 miles per hour according to the news reports later, and the bounce house, that massive improperly anchored structure, lifted. Sarah would remember this moment in fragments for the rest of her life. The sound of parents screaming, children crying, the terrible groaning of metal stakes ripping free from earth that had been softened by yesterday's rain. The bounce house lifted 6 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet into the air, children still inside, their screams mixing with the wind's howl. Then it came down, not gently, not safely. It came down twisted, the metal frame collapsing in on itself with a sound like a car crash, vinyl tearing, the whole structure folding and crumpling into a mangled heap of fabric and steel. The chaos that followed would blur in Sarah's memory. Emergency sirens, parents running toward the wreckage, festival workers shouting into radios, firefighters arriving within minutes and beginning the careful work of extracting children from the collapsed structure. But one image remained crystal clear. Liam, her silent son, standing perfectly still in the midst of pandemonium, his small face turned toward the wreckage, tears streaming down his cheeks, his mouth forming words that made no sound. She dropped to her knees beside him, pulled him close. "It's okay, baby. Everyone's getting out. Everyone's going to be okay." But he shook his head violently, his small hands pushing against her, pointing toward the collapsed bounce house with an urgency that bordered on panic. 3 hours later, all the children had been accounted for. Miraculously, incredibly, no one had been seriously injured. Bumps, bruises, one broken arm, but no fatalities, no life-threatening injuries. The emergency responders were calling it a miracle. Parents were crying with relief, hugging their children, thanking God and luck and the quick response of the rescue teams. The festival grounds were being cleared, the damaged bounce house cordoned off with yellow caution tape, plans being made for removal and investigation. But Liam wouldn't leave. Sarah had tried everything, bribing with ice cream, promising his favorite dinner, even raising her voice in frustration. But her son stood at the safety perimeter, his small body pressed against the caution tape, his hands reaching toward the wreckage as if he could touch something no one else could see. "Liam, honey, we need to go home." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm, exhaustion making her words heavy. It was nearly 7 o'clock now, the sun setting behind storm clouds that still hung low and threatening. "Everyone's safe. Everyone got out. There's nothing here anymore." But Liam turned to look at her, and the expression on his small face stopped her words in her throat. It was a look of such desperate urgency, such absolute certainty, that for a moment she felt something shift in her chest, the first whisper of belief in what she'd been, dismissing all day. He dropped to his knees right there in the grass, still damp from the storm, and began drawing with his finger in the mud, fast, frantic movements. Sarah knelt beside him, watching as shapes emerged, 7 shapes, 4 legs each, tails, dogs. He was drawing dogs. "Baby, what are you—" But he was already drawing more details, his small fingers moving with surprising precision. One dog with a dark face, like a mask. Another with a white chest, a third smaller than the others. Different sizes, different markings, each one distinct. He drew them all in a row, and then he drew something else, a box around them, dark scribbles that might have been walls or darkness or both. He looked up at her, and for the first time in 6 months, he spoke. One word, barely a whisper, his small voice rusty from disuse. "Inside." Sarah felt her heart stop. "Inside what, Liam?" But even as she asked, she knew. She looked at the collapsed bounce house, at the twisted metal frame and torn vinyl, at the heap of wreckage that rescue teams had already declared clear. "Honey, there are no dogs in there. There were no dogs at the festival. You must have seen something else. Or maybe you're remembering—" But he was shaking his head, violent, desperate, his small hands gripping her arm with surprising strength. He pointed at his drawing, then at the wreckage, then back at his drawing. 7 dogs. Inside. Trapped. Nobody was renting dogs for the festival. Nobody had brought dogs to the festival. It was against the rules, posted clearly at every entrance. And even if someone had, even if somehow dogs had gotten into the bounce house before it collapsed, the rescue teams had searched thoroughly. They'd used thermal imaging. They'd accounted for every person, every child, every warm body that had been anywhere near the structure. Sarah knew this. She knew it logically, rationally, with the certainty of an adult who understood how the world worked. But she also knew her son, knew that he didn't lie, didn't make up stories for attention, didn't speak at all unless something was desperately, urgently important. And he was speaking now, one word over and over, his small voice breaking. "Inside, inside, inside." The next 4 hours tested Sarah's sanity and her faith in her son in ways she would never forget. She tried to get Liam to leave, tried to carry him to the car, but he went completely rigid, his small body becoming dead weight, his silent tears turning to sobs that shook his entire frame. She tried to explain again that there were no dogs, that the rescue teams had checked, that he must be confused or scared, or processing the trauma of witnessing the collapse. But he just kept drawing. The same 7 dogs, over and over, in the dirt, on napkins she pulled from her purse, on the back of a festival flyer someone had dropped. Each drawing more detailed than the last. The dark-faced dog with pointed ears, the one with 3 white paws, the smallest one with a crooked tail. He drew them trapped in darkness, drew air bubbles getting smaller above their heads like they were drowning, drew them crying, their mouths open in silent howls. At 7:15 p.m., a firefighter named Carlos Rodriguez approached them. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and kind-eyed, still in his gear from the rescue operation. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but we need to clear the area. The structural engineers need to assess the damage before we can begin removal, and it's not safe to have civilians this close." Sarah nodded, started to gather Liam, but Rodriguez was watching the boy with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What's he drawing?" "Dogs," Sarah said, embarrassment heating her cheeks. "He thinks there are dogs trapped in there. He's been insisting for hours, but obviously... She trailed off because Rodriguez had knelt down beside Liam, was studying the drawings with unexpected intensity. "How many?" he asked, his voice gentle. Liam held up 7 fingers, his small hand trembling. 7 dogs, and you're sure they're in there? In the bounce house? Liam nodded, then stood and walked along the perimeter of the caution tape, stopping at specific intervals. He pressed his ear to the ground at each stop, his small body going completely still, listening to something no one else could hear. Rodriguez watched this with growing interest. "I do search and rescue," he said quietly to Sarah. "Trained in disaster response, avalanche rescue, building collapse. One thing I learned, sometimes victims can hear things we can't. Sometimes they can sense things our equipment misses." He pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Rodriguez. I need ground-penetrating radar at Riverside Park, the bounce house collapse site. Yes, I know we already cleared it. Just send it." He looked at Sarah. "Your son, does he have any sensory processing differences? Autism, ADHD, anything like that?" Sarah felt defensive, protective. "He has selective mutism, since my husband left. But he doesn't make things up." Rodriguez held up his hands. "I'm not suggesting he does. I'm suggesting he might be hearing something we're not. Kids on the spectrum sometimes have hypersensitivity to sounds. They can hear frequencies adults can't, vibrations we miss. If there's any possibility..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. If there was any possibility that something was trapped in that wreckage, they had to check. The radar operator arrived at 8:03 p.m., a woman named Janet who looked annoyed at being called back to a site that had already been cleared. She set up her equipment with efficient, irritated movements, clearly expecting to find nothing. Sarah held Liam's small hand, feeling his grip tighten as Janet began the scan. The machine made a steady beeping sound, regular and monotonous as she moved it across the ground near the collapsed structure. Beep, beep, beep. Then the beeping changed, faster, urgent. Janet's face went pale. She moved the scanner again, slower this time, more carefully. The beeping intensified. "There's a void," she said, her voice tight. "A space, an air pocket, and..." She adjusted the settings, stared at the screen. "There are heat signatures, multiple heat signatures. Something's alive down there." Rodriguez was already moving, calling for his team, for equipment, for lights. Sarah felt her legs go weak. Liam's small hand squeezed hers once, hard. And then he pulled free and ran to the exact spot where Janet's scanner had found the void. He dropped to his knees, pressed both small hands flat against the ground, and closed his eyes. His lips moved, forming words Sarah couldn't hear. And somewhere beneath the earth, beneath the twisted metal and torn vinyl, something responded. A sound so faint it might have been imagination. A whimper, weak and desperate, and somehow synchronized with the movement of Liam's small mouth, as if he and whatever was trapped below were speaking the same language, singing the same song. The excavation began at 8:25 p.m., and it was the most terrifying thing Sarah had ever witnessed. Rodriguez's team worked with agonizing slowness, removing debris piece by piece, testing the stability of each section before proceeding. The bounce house had collapsed in on itself, creating a maze of vinyl chambers and crushed metal frame. Some sections pressed flat, others ballooned with trapped air. The structure was unstable, liable to shift and collapse further at any disturbance. "We have to be careful," Rodriguez explained to Sarah, his voice low. "If something's alive down there, one wrong move could kill it, or kill my team." But Liam was pulling at Rodriguez's sleeve, his small face urgent, pointing to a specific section of the wreckage. Rodriguez followed the direction of his finger, then looked at Janet. "Can you scan that area specifically?" Janet moved her equipment to the spot Liam had indicated, and the readings went wild. "That's it," she breathed. "That's where they are, whatever they are." Rodriguez's team converged on the location, working faster now, but still carefully, so carefully. They removed a section of twisted metal frame, then another. Beneath it, a layer of vinyl, torn and filthy. They cut through it with careful precision, and suddenly, movement. Fur. A flash of black and tan. And then a face emerged from the darkness, a German shepherd's face, eyes barely open, tongue lolling, pressed against the vinyl like it had been trying to breathe through the thin material. One of Rodriguez's team gasped, "Jesus Christ, there's a dog. There's actually a dog." But there wasn't just one dog. As they carefully expanded the opening, more faces appeared. Another German Shepherd, and another, and another. 7 total, just as Liam had drawn. 7 German Shepherds, all trapped in a collapsed vinyl chamber that had been created when the bounce house frame buckled, creating an accidental pocket of air beneath the wreckage. They were in catastrophic condition. Sarah could see that even from where she stood, Liam's small hand gripping hers so tightly it hurt. The dogs were emaciated, ribs showing through matted fur, their breathing labored and rasping. One had a hind leg bent at an impossible angle. Another had blood crusted around its muzzle. The smallest, a juvenile maybe 8 months old, wasn't moving at all. "How long have they been here?" one of the rescue workers asked, and the question hung in the air like an accusation. The bounce house had collapsed just 6 hours ago, but these dogs hadn't been trapped for 6 hours. Their condition suggested days, maybe weeks, of suffering, which meant they had been in there before the collapse, which meant someone had put them there. Sarah felt her stomach turn, felt rage and horror and disbelief warring in her chest. Who would do this? How? Why? But Liam was already moving, pulling free from her grip with surprising strength, ducking under the caution tape before she could stop him. "Liam, no!" Sarah lunged for him, but Rodriguez caught her arm. "Wait," he said quietly. "Just wait." Liam approached the opening in the wreckage slowly, his small body low to the ground, his movements gentle and unthreatening. The lead dog, the one with the dark face mask that Liam had drawn first, most prominently, watched him approach. Her eyes were amber and ancient and full of pain so deep it seemed bottomless. She should have snarled, should have snapped, should have shown fear or aggression or something, but she didn't. She just watched as this small human child crawled toward her, watched as he reached out one small hand, palm up, offering. Not touching. Just offering. And then the dog did something that made every person watching stop breathing. She moved, despite her injuries, despite her obvious agony, despite the fact that moving might cause the unstable structure to collapse further. She moved. She stretched her neck forward just an inch, just enough to touch her nose to Liam's small palm. The contact lasted maybe 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds, something passed between them, something visible, something tangible, something that made Rodriguez whisper, "Holy shit," and made Sarah's eyes fill with tears she couldn't explain. The dog's eyes closed. Her whole body seemed to relax, the tension that had been holding her rigid suddenly releasing. And Liam made a sound, that humming pattern he'd been making all day, low and rhythmic and somehow ancient, like a song from before language, before words, when humans and animals spoke the same tongue. The other 6 dogs responded to the sound. One by one, their heads lifted, their eyes opened, their attention focused on this small boy who had somehow found them, who had somehow known they were there when no one else had believed. The smallest dog, the one who hadn't been moving, stirred. Its chest rose and fell, shallow but steady. Alive, still alive. Rodriguez was already calling for a veterinary trauma team, for transport, for everything they would need to save 7 dogs who shouldn't have survived this long, who by all logic and reason should have been dead hours or days ago. But they weren't dead. They were alive, because a 3-year-old boy with selective mutism had heard them when no one else could, had believed in them when no one else would, had refused to leave until someone listened. The extraction took another 45 minutes, each dog carefully removed from the collapsed chamber, each one assessed and stabilized as much as possible on site. They were in horrific condition. Severe dehydration after at least 8 hours without water, multiple fractured ribs on 4 of the dogs, the one with the crushed hind leg requiring immediate surgery, all of them suffering from heat stroke after hours trapped in what had essentially been a vinyl oven under the afternoon sun. The bounce house's interior temperature, one of the paramedics estimated, had probably reached 120 degrees. The dogs should have died from heat exposure alone, never mind the dehydration, the injuries, the suffocation risk. "This is impossible," the on-site veterinary tech kept saying, checking vitals, starting IV lines with shaking hands. They shouldn't have survived this. The heat alone should have killed them within 4 hours. The dehydration should have caused organ failure. This is medically impossible. But Liam didn't seem to think it was impossible. He stayed close to the dogs as they were extracted, his small presence somehow calming them in a way that made no medical sense. The dogs who should have been too traumatized, too pain-addled, too frightened to tolerate human touch, allowed him near. More than allowed. They sought him out. When the lead dog was placed on a stretcher, she whimpered and tried to lift her head, searching. Liam appeared at her side, his small hand on her head, and she quieted immediately. When the smallest dog went into respiratory distress, thrashing and panicking as the vet tech tried to intubate, Liam crawled close and hummed that pattern again. And the puppy went still, allowed the procedure, its eyes locked on the boy's small face like he was the only real thing in a world gone mad. "What's he doing?" the vet tech asked Sarah, wonder and confusion mixing in her voice. "I've never seen anything like this. It's like they know him, like they trust him." Sarah shook her head, unable to explain what she was seeing, unable to process the impossible reality of the last 6 hours. Her son, who hadn't spoken more than a handful of words in 6 months, was communicating with 7 dying dogs. Not with words, with something deeper, something that transcended language. The dogs understood him, and somehow, impossibly, he understood them. As the last dog was loaded into the emergency veterinary transport, Rodriguez approached Sarah. His face was grim. "We need to talk about how they got there," he said quietly. "The bounce house was delivered to the park yesterday morning, set up by 3 p.m. The festival started today at noon, which means these dogs were in there, trapped in that deflated chamber, for at least 24 hours before the collapse. Someone put them there. Someone stuffed 7 German Shepherds into a bounce house chamber and then just left them. This isn't an accident. This is deliberate." Sarah felt cold despite the warm evening air. Who would do that? Why? But Rodriguez's expression told her he had theories, none of them good. "I'm calling the police, and animal control, and probably the FBI, because if someone is trafficking dogs, using commercial equipment to transport them..." He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. This wasn't just animal cruelty. This was organized. This was planned. This was part of something bigger, something darker, something that had been happening right under everyone's noses at a community festival full of families and children and innocents. Liam tugged at Sarah's sleeve, his small face turned toward the departing veterinary transport, his eyes following the vehicle as it pulled away with its cargo of broken, suffering dogs. He looked up at his mother, and his small voice, still rusty from months of disuse, asked a question that would haunt her for weeks. "Will they be okay?" Sarah knelt down, pulled her son close, felt his small body trembling against hers. "I don't know, baby," she whispered into his hair. "I really don't know." But even as she said it, she felt something shift inside her chest, a certainty that had no logical basis, no rational foundation, but was absolute nonetheless. These dogs would survive. They had to survive, because her son had found them, had heard them, had refused to give up on them when everyone else had dismissed his certainty as childish imagination. They would survive because Liam Chen, 3 years old, selective mute, abandoned by his father and dismissed by the world, had given them a reason to fight, had given them hope, had given them someone who believed. The veterinary clinic was a war zone when they arrived. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, the trauma veterinarian Rodriguez had called, had assembled a team of 6, 3 vet techs, 2 surgical nurses, and another veterinarian specializing in emergency medicine. They'd converted the clinic's main surgical suite and 2 recovery rooms into a triage center. Each dog assigned a station, each station equipped with IV fluids, monitoring equipment, oxygen support, everything they might need to save 7 lives that were hanging by threads so thin they were nearly invisible. Dr. Okonkwo was a woman in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that had seen too much suffering to be shocked by anything anymore. But when she saw the 7 German Shepherds laid out in her clinic, when she began her initial assessments and realized the extent of their injuries and the impossibility of their survival, her professional composure cracked. "They've been without water for at least 24 hours, she said, her voice tight with controlled fury as she examined the lead dog. "Probably longer. Look at the sunken eyes, the tacky mucous membranes, the skin tenting. This is severe dehydration, the kind that causes kidney failure, organ damage, death, and the heat exposure. She checked the dog's temperature, swore softly. Hyperthermia. Her core temperature is still elevated hours after extraction. She was literally cooking from the inside out. The fractures were extensive. 4 of the 7 dogs had broken ribs, likely from the bounce house frame collapsing on top of them. The dog with the crushed hind leg, Dr. Okonkwo's preliminary x-rays showed a shattered femur, multiple fracture points, bone fragments. This will require surgical pinning, she explained to Sarah, who had refused to leave, who stood in the corner of the clinic with Liam's small hand in hers, watching everything with horrified fascination. Multiple surgeries, actually, months of recovery, and that's if she survives the night, which, Dr. Okonkwo paused, chose her words carefully. The odds aren't good for any of them. The dehydration alone should have caused irreversible organ damage. The heat exposure should have caused brain damage. The trauma, the pain, the stress, their bodies should be shutting down. They should be dying right now. But they weren't dying. Despite everything, despite medical logic and statistical probability and the grim realities of trauma veterinary medicine, they were holding on. Barely, desperately, but holding on nonetheless. Dr. Okonkwo started aggressive fluid resuscitation, pushing IV fluids to combat the dehydration, administering pain medication and antibiotics and anti-inflammatories. She intubated the smallest dog, the puppy who had stopped breathing during extraction, and placed him on a ventilator. She splinted the crushed leg temporarily, stabilizing it for surgery that would have to wait until the dog was strong enough to survive anesthesia. She worked with the focused intensity of someone fighting a battle she knew she was likely to lose, but refusing to surrender without exhausting every option. The dogs tolerated the interventions with a docility that made no sense given their condition and obvious history of trauma. They should have been aggressive, should have been terrified of human touch, should have fought every needle stick and examination and procedure, but they didn't. They lay still, eyes half closed, breathing labored but steady, accepting the help they were being offered with something that looked almost like gratitude, almost like they'd been waiting for this, almost like they'd known somehow that if they could just hold on long enough, help would come, except for when the staff tried to move Liam away. At 11:47 p.m., one of the vet techs gently suggested that Sarah take her son home. He was exhausted, swaying on his feet, his small face pale with fatigue. Sarah agreed, started to lead Liam toward the door. And that's when everything went wrong. The lead dog, the one with the dark face mask, the one who had touched Liam's hand first, lunged. Despite her IV lines, despite her injuries, despite the fact that she was barely strong enough to lift her head, she lunged off the examination table with a snarl that made every person in the room freeze. She landed badly, collapsed immediately, but continued to drag herself across the floor toward the door, toward Liam, making sounds that were half bark, half howl, desperate and demanding, and absolutely unmistakable in their meaning. Don't take him away. Dr. Okonkwo moved to restrain the dog, but Liam was already there, dropping to his knees beside her, his small hands gentle on her head. "It's okay," he whispered, his small voice barely audible. "I'm not leaving, I promise. I'm staying right here." The dog went still immediately, her amber eyes locked on his small face, her whole body relaxing despite the pain that must have been screaming through her system. Liam looked up at his mother, and Sarah saw something in his expression that made her chest tight, a determination that was far too adult for a 3-year-old, a certainty that transcended his limited understanding of the world. "I have to stay," he said simply. "She needs me." And she did need him. They all did. Over the next hour, as Dr. Okonkwo and her team continued their work, a pattern emerged that would change everything Sarah thought she understood about the world, about her son, about the nature of connection between humans and animals. Every time Liam moved away from the dogs, even just to the other side of the room, their vital signs deteriorated. Heart rates increased, breathing became labored. The monitors beeped with warnings of distress. But when Liam returned, when he placed his small hands on them, when he hummed that strange pattern that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, their vitals stabilized. Heart rates slowed to normal ranges. Breathing eased. The monitors quieted. It was as if his presence, his specific individual presence, was a form of medicine, a treatment more effective than anything in Dr. Okonkwo's arsenal. "This doesn't make sense," Dr. Okonkwo kept saying, checking readings, rechecking them, running tests to make sure her equipment wasn't malfunctioning. "Vital signs don't respond to emotional comfort this dramatically. Yes, stress affects physiology, but this—" She gestured at the monitors, at the clear, undeniable correlation between Liam's proximity and the dog's stability. "This is beyond normal stress response. This is something else entirely." At 2:47 a.m., exactly 12 hours after Liam had first heard the dogs and tried to tell his mother they were trapped, the dog with internal bleeding crashed. His name was Duke. Dr. Okonkwo had determined from his microchip, and he was 5 years old, and he was dying. His blood pressure plummeted, his heart rate became erratic, the monitor screaming warnings that everyone in the room understood. Hemorrhagic shock, uncontrolled internal bleeding. Despite the IV fluids, despite the medications, despite everything Dr. Okonkwo had done, his body was giving up. She worked frantically, pushing more fluids, administering clotting factors, preparing for emergency surgery, even though she knew he wouldn't survive the anesthesia. The monitor's beeping became a flat line. Duke's chest stopped moving, his eyes glazed. Dr. Okonkwo began CPR, her hands pressing rhythmic compressions on his chest, counting under her breath, refusing to accept what her experience told her was inevitable. Liam had been dozing in the corner, curled up on a blanket one of the vet techs had provided, exhausted beyond measure. But at the exact moment Duke's heart stopped, his eyes flew open. He sat up, looked directly at the table where Duke lay, and made a sound. Not a word, not a cry, but something primal and desperate and absolutely certain. He ran across the room, his small feet slapping on the tile floor, and before anyone could stop him, he climbed onto the table beside Duke's body. "Liam, no!" Sarah started forward, but Dr. Okonkwo held up a hand, her eyes wide, her expression caught between disbelief and something that might have been hope. Liam placed both his small hands on Duke's chest, right over his heart. He closed his eyes, and he hummed. That pattern, that song, that language from before words. The sound filled the room, resonated in Sarah's chest like she could feel it in her bones. 30 seconds passed. 45. The monitor stayed flat. Dr. Okonkwo's hands stilled on Duke's chest, her professional assessment clear. He was gone. There was no coming back from this. But Liam didn't move. His small hands stayed pressed to Duke's chest, his humming continuing, steady and certain and absolutely unwavering. And then the monitor blipped. Once. Twice. A rhythm emerging from the flatline, weak but there, unmistakably there. Duke's chest rose, fell, rose again. His eyes focused, found Liam's small face hovering above him. And something passed between them, something everyone in the room saw but no one could explain. Recognition. Connection. A bond that transcended species, transcended logic, transcended everything science and medicine claimed to understand about the boundaries between human and animal, between life and death, between possible and impossible. Dr. Okonkwo checked Duke's abdomen, her hands gentle but thorough, her expression moving from shock to wonder, to something that looked almost like fear. "The bleeding stopped," she whispered. "The hemorrhage. It was too severe, too extensive. There's no medical explanation for—" She looked at Liam, at his small hands still resting on Duke's chest, at his small face serene, with a certainty that should have been impossible for a 3-year-old. "What are you?" she asked, and it wasn't an insult or an accusation, just genuine, awed curiosity. "What are you doing to them?" Liam looked at her, his dark eyes ancient and knowing in his small face, and spoke his third complete sentence since his father had left 6 months ago. "I'm telling them it's okay to stay, that someone wants them, that they don't have to go into the dark alone." His small voice broke on the last word, tears streaming down his cheeks. Nobody should have to go into the dark alone. Sarah felt something crack open in her chest, felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally break free, because she understood, suddenly and completely, what her son was doing. He was saving these dogs, yes, but he was also saving himself. Every time he told them they were wanted, he was telling himself he was wanted. Every time he promised them someone would stay, he was promising himself someone would stay. Every time he pulled them back from the dark, he was pulling himself back too. The dog's abandonment was his abandonment. Their suffering was his suffering. Their survival was his survival. They were mirrors, reflecting each other's pain and each other's desperate, defiant refusal to give up. Dr. Okonkwo wiped her eyes, cleared her throat, returned to her professional composure with visible effort. "Okay," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "Okay, if his presence stabilizes them, then he stays. We'll set up a cot, we'll bring in food, whatever he needs. But he doesn't leave, not until they're stable, not until—" She paused, seemed to be wrestling with something. "Not until we understand what this is, because this isn't normal, this isn't medical, this is something else. And I need to document it. I need to understand it. She stopped, shook her head. "I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 23 years. I thought I'd seen everything, but I've never seen this. I've never seen anything like this." The rest of that long night passed in a blur of procedures and monitoring and small victories that felt like miracles. The puppy on the ventilator began breathing on his own, strong enough to be extubated hours ahead of schedule. The dog with the crushed leg, her name was Duchess, the microchip revealed, the lead dog who had touched Liam's hand first, showed no signs of infection despite the severity of her injury, her body somehow fighting off the bacteria that should have been colonizing the wound. The 4 dogs with fractured ribs showed improvement in their breathing, their lungs expanding more fully, their pain seemingly less despite the fact that broken ribs should have been agonizing for days. And through it all, Liam stayed. He moved from dog to dog, his small hands gentle on their heads, their sides, their paws. He hummed that pattern, that song, that language that seemed to bypass their brains and speak, directly to something deeper, their souls maybe, if dogs had souls. And watching them respond to this small boy's touch, Sarah found herself absolutely certain that they did. He spoke to them occasionally, his small voice quiet but clear, telling them things that made Sarah's heart ache. "You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore. I won't let them, I promise. I keep my promises even when other people don't." At one point, around 4 a.m., Dr. Okonkwo pulled Sarah aside. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Has your son ever shown abilities like this before? Any kind of unusual connection with animals? Any signs of—" She paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase it. "Any signs of something beyond normal empathy?" Sarah thought about it, really thought about it, reaching back through memories of Liam's short life. "He's always been sensitive," she said slowly. "Even as a baby, he'd cry when he heard dogs barking, like he could feel their distress. And once, when he was 2, we were at the park and he ran up to this old man walking a dog. The dog was limping, and Liam pointed at its paw and said, 'Hurts.' The man was shocked, said the dog had a thorn in its pad that he hadn't even noticed yet. But I thought, I don't know. I thought it was just observation, just a smart kid noticing things." She paused. After his father left, he stopped talking, but he started drawing. Animals, mostly. Dogs and cats and birds. And sometimes he'd draw them sad or hurt. And then the next day we'd see a news story about an animal rescue in that exact area, that exact type of animal. But I thought, "You thought it was coincidence?" Dr. Okonkwo finished. "Pattern recognition, confirmation bias, the human tendency to see connections where none exist." Sarah nodded, feeling defensive, feeling like she'd failed her son somehow by dismissing what now seemed so obvious. Dr. Okonkwo's expression softened. "Don't blame yourself. What you're describing, what I'm witnessing right now, it's beyond anything in the medical literature. If I wasn't seeing it with my own eyes, if I didn't have the monitors and the vitals and the documentation, I wouldn't believe it either. But it's real. Whatever this is, whatever he's doing, it's real. And it's keeping these dogs alive." Morning came slowly, gray light filtering through the clinic windows, the city waking up outside, while inside, 7 dogs slept peacefully for the first time in God knew how long, and one small boy slept beside them, his small body curled against Duchess's side, his small hand resting on her head even in sleep. Dr. Okonkwo had finally convinced Sarah to go home, shower, eat, rest for a few hours. I'll call you if anything changes, she'd promised. But honestly, I think they're stable now. I think the crisis has passed. I think... She'd paused, chosen her words carefully. I think your son saved their lives. I don't know how, and I don't know why, but I know that without him, they'd all be dead right now. Every single one of them. Sarah drove home in a daze, her mind struggling to process the last 18 hours. Her son, her silent, traumatized son, had heard 7 dogs trapped in a collapsed bounce house when no one else could. He'd insisted they were there when every adult dismissed him. He'd drawn them with impossible accuracy before anyone had seen them. He'd kept them calm during extraction. He'd stabilized them when medical intervention failed. He'd brought one back from clinical death. These weren't the actions of a normal 3-year-old. These weren't even the actions of a normal human. This was something else, something that defied explanation, something that made Sarah's rational, scientific worldview crumble like the bounce house frame under storm winds. She called her sister, Lisa, who was a child psychologist specializing in trauma. I need you to come to the clinic, Sarah said without preamble. I need you to see something. Her voice broke. I need someone to tell me I'm not crazy, that what I'm seeing is real, that my son is... She couldn't finish. Couldn't articulate what her son was because she didn't have words for it. Gifted seemed too small. Special seemed too vague. Supernatural seemed too frightening. But something in that direction, something in that territory of abilities that shouldn't exist, that couldn't exist according to everything she'd been taught about how the world worked. Lisa arrived at the clinic at 9 a.m. with Dr. Raymond Torres, a colleague who specialized in autism spectrum disorders and unusual cognitive development. They found Liam awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Duchess's recovery crate, drawing on a large pad of paper Dr. Okonkwo had provided. He was drawing the dogs again, but differently now. Not trapped, not suffering. Playing, running, happy. 7 dogs in a field, chasing balls, tails wagging, tongues lolling in the doggy smiles. And in the center of the drawing, a small figure, a boy, himself, surrounded by the dogs, protected by them, loved by them. Dr. Torres watched Liam for several minutes without speaking, his trained eyes cataloging behaviors, movements, the way Liam's attention shifted between his drawing and the dogs, the way he hummed softly under his breath, the way Duchess's ears pricked up every time he made a sound. Finally, Torres knelt beside Liam. Hi, Liam. My name is Raymond. Can I ask you about your drawing? Liam looked up, studied Torres with those 2 old eyes, then nodded. These are the dogs you found? Liam nodded again. How did you know they were there, in the bounce house? Liam was quiet for a long moment, his small brow furrowed with concentration, trying to find words for something that existed beyond language. I heard them, he said finally, his small voice certain. Not with my ears, with my inside, the place where feelings live. They were calling for help, and I heard them in my inside, and I knew I had to find them because nobody else was listening. Nobody else could hear them calling. Torres exchanged a glance with Lisa, his expression caught between fascination and disbelief. When you say you heard them in your inside, do you mean you felt them, like an emotion? Liam shook his head. Not like when I'm sad or happy. Different. Like they were talking to me, but without words, showing me pictures in my head, showing me where they were, what it looked like, how scared they were. And I showed them pictures back, showed them I was coming, showed them they had just had to hold on a little longer, showed them somebody cared. Can you show me? Torres asked gently. Can you show me how you communicate with them? Liam looked at Duchess, his small face serious. He closed his eyes, and his humming started again, that pattern that seemed to resonate in the bones. Duchess's ears pricked forward. Her tail wagged once, twice, despite the pain she must have been in. Her eyes locked on Liam's small face with an intensity that was almost human in its focus. And then she did something that made everyone in the room stop breathing. She stood. Despite her injuries, despite the IV line still attached to her leg, despite the fact that she'd been too weak to stand just hours ago, she stood. She walked, slowly, carefully, but steadily, to where Liam sat. And she placed her head in his lap, a gesture of trust so profound it brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Liam opened his eyes, placed his small hands on Duchess's head, and smiled. "She says thank you," he told the room. "She says she knew I would come. She could hear me too, in her inside. She told the others to hold on, that help was coming, that they just had to be brave a little longer. She's the leader. She kept them alive. She's the bravest dog in the whole world." Dr. Torres pulled out a notebook, began writing rapidly, his hand shaking slightly. "Liam, I'm going to ask you to do something, and I want you to tell me if you can't, okay? No pressure, no judgment. But I'm going to take you to another room, away from the dogs, and I'm going to do something to one of them. Nothing that hurts, just a gentle touch. And I want to see if you can tell me which dog I touched and where. Can you try that?" Liam nodded, his expression solemn, understanding somehow that this was important, that the adults needed proof of something they couldn't quite believe. Torres led Liam to Dr. Okonkwo's office, closed the door, asked him to sit facing away from the window so he couldn't see into the treatment area. Then Torres returned to the main room, where 6 dogs lay in various states of recovery. Duchess had been gently returned to her crate despite her protest. He approached the smallest dog, the puppy, whose microchip had revealed his name as Scout, and gently pressed on his left front paw. Not hard, not painfully, just enough pressure to be noticeable. Scout's ears pricked forward, but he didn't react otherwise. In the office, Liam gasped. His small hand flew to his own left wrist, clutching it. "Scout," he said clearly, his voice carrying through the door. His front paw, the left one. It doesn't hurt, but he felt it. "He's confused why you're touching him." Torres's eyes widened. He moved to another dog, one named Valor, according to his chip, and scratched behind his right ear. In the office, Liam giggled. "That tickles. Valor likes it. He wants more." Torres conducted the test 5 more times, touching different dogs in different places. And every single time, Liam identified the correct dog and the correct location. The statistical probability of guessing correctly 7 times in a row was less than 1%. This wasn't guessing. This wasn't lucky. This was something else entirely. Torres returned to the office, found Liam looking exhausted, his small face pale. "That's hard," Liam said softly. "Feeling what they feel. It's like being 7 people at once. It's really, really hard." "I believe you," Torres said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "Liam, what you're doing, what you can do, it's extraordinary. It's beyond anything I've studied, anything I've read about, anything medical science currently understands. You're not just empathetic. You're not just sensitive. You're experiencing their physical sensations in real time. You're sharing their consciousness somehow. Do you understand what that means?" Liam shook his head, because how could a 3-year-old understand consciousness, understand the implications of what Torres was suggesting? That the boundaries between self and other, between human and animal, between one mind and another, were somehow permeable for this child in ways they weren't for anyone else. "It means you're special," Torres said gently. "It means you have a gift, a very rare, very important gift. And it means we need to understand it, to document it, to help you learn how to use it without exhausting yourself." But even as Torres spoke, even as he began planning the research protocols and the documentation and the papers he would write, Sarah was thinking about something else. She was thinking about 7 dogs who had been stuffed into a bounce house and left to die. She was thinking about someone who had done that deliberately, cruelly, with full knowledge of the suffering they were causing. She was thinking about justice and revenge and the burning need to make sure whoever had done this paid for every moment of pain those dogs had endured. The police arrived at noon, led by Detective Marcus Webb, no relation to the bounce house company owner, he was quick to clarify. Webb was a large man with kind eyes and a notebook that had seen better days, and he listened to Sarah's account of the previous day with an expression that grew progressively grimmer. "So, let me make sure I understand," he said slowly. 7 German Shepherds were trapped inside the bounce house before it was even inflated, which means someone put them there during transport or setup, which means this was planned, deliberate, and given the condition of the dogs, given the evidence of long-term neglect and abuse, this isn't just animal cruelty. This is part of a larger operation. Dr. Okonkwo provided the medical records, the microchip information, the evidence of systematic abuse that went far beyond the immediate trauma of being trapped in a bounce house. "These dogs have old injuries," she explained, showing Webb x-rays that revealed healed fractures, evidence of malnutrition over months, scarring consistent with repeated trauma. This wasn't a one-time thing. They've been suffering for a long time. And look at this. She pulled up the microchip registrations. All 7 dogs are registered to the same owner, Marcus Webb. She paused, looked at the detective. Wait, that's my name, Webb finished, his voice flat. But I don't own any dogs, never have. Someone's using my identity. He pulled out his phone, made a call, his expression darkening as he listened to whoever was on the other end. Okay, I'm on my way. He hung up, looked at Sarah and Dr. Okonkwo. The bounce house company, Webb's Party Rentals. It's owned by my cousin, Marcus Webb Jr. We're both named after our grandfather. And apparently, my cousin has been running a side business that the main company knew nothing about. Animal Control is executing a warrant at his warehouse right now. And what they're finding? He paused, his jaw tight. It's bad. Really bad. The warehouse was a nightmare made real. Sarah would see the photos later, would wish she hadn't, would have nightmares for weeks about what humans were capable of doing to innocent creatures. Animal Control found 23 more German Shepherds in the basement, kept in cages stacked floor to ceiling, no water for days, minimal food, the dogs fighting over scraps that were thrown in once every few days. The smell alone made the first responders vomit. The sounds, the whimpering, the desperate barking, the scratching of paws against metal would haunt everyone who heard them. Marcus Webb Jr. bred German Shepherds, the investigation revealed. Not for pets, not for show. For guard dogs. Aggressive, poorly socialized animals sold to people who wanted intimidation more than companionship. But the 7 dogs Liam had found weren't aggressive enough. They were too gentle, too friendly, too eager to please. They failed the training that involved deliberate abuse designed to make them mean. So, Webb had decided to dispose of them. The bounce house was perfect, a commercial vehicle that traveled between locations that no one would think to search. He'd stuffed the 7 reject dogs into the deflated bounce house during transport, planning to drive to the landfill after the festival and dump them there, structure and all. The storm had ruined his plan. The collapse had trapped them before he could complete the disposal. They were never meant to be found. They were meant to disappear, to die slowly in a landfill, to become nothing more than a statistic in the endless, invisible war against animals who couldn't speak for themselves. Except one 3-year-old boy had heard them, had refused to stop hearing them, had believed in them when no one else would, had saved them from a death that was meant to be silent and unnoticed and forgotten. The news broke that evening, and it went viral within hours. Nonverbal autistic toddler saves 7 dogs. Through mysterious connection, read one headline. Child's supernatural ability leads to major animal cruelty bust, read another. The local news ran the story at 6 p.m., and by 7 p.m. it had been picked up by national outlets. By 8 p.m. it was trending on social media. By 9 p.m., Dr. Okonkwo's clinic was surrounded by news vans, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, the modern machinery of viral content grinding into action. Sarah refused all interview requests, protecting Liam from the attention, from the questions he was too young to understand, from the scrutiny that would turn him into a spectacle instead of a child. But she couldn't protect him from the threats that started almost immediately. Marcus Webb Jr. made bail, $50,000, which his lawyer paid within hours, and the first thing he did was post on social media. That freak kid and his devil dogs destroyed my business. Everything I worked for, gone because some autistic brat made up stories and everyone believed him. This isn't over, not by a long shot. The threats escalated quickly. A brick through their apartment window at 2 a.m., glass shattering across Liam's bedroom floor while he slept. Their car vandalized in the parking lot, tires slashed, obscenities spray-painted across the hood. Someone following Sarah to work, a man in a dark truck who stayed 3 cars back but never quite disappeared. The police assigned protection, a patrol car parked outside their building, an officer walking Sarah to and from her car. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough, because Webb wasn't working alone. The investigation was revealing connections to underground dog-fighting rings in 3 states, to breeding operations that supplied bait dogs. Gentle dogs like German Shepherds used to train fighting dogs, dogs who were tortured and killed for the entertainment of people who had forgotten what it meant to be human. The complication came 3 days after the rescue, when the investigation revealed that Webb's brother, Daniel Webb, was a sheriff's deputy in the neighboring county. Daniel had been feeding Marcus information about police movements, about warrant applications, about investigation progress. Internal Affairs opened an inquiry, but Daniel was careful. He covered his tracks, used burner phones, communicated through encrypted apps. The FBI got involved, but building a case took time, and time was something Sarah and Liam didn't have. The 7 dogs, meanwhile, were healing, slowly, painfully, but healing nonetheless. Duke's internal bleeding had stopped completely, his organs showing no signs of the failure that should have been inevitable. Duchess's crushed leg was responding to treatment better than Dr. Okonkwo had dared hope. The surgery had gone well, the pins were holding, and she was already bearing weight on the leg during physical therapy. Scout, the puppy who had stopped breathing, was playing again, his tail wagging, his eyes bright with the resilience of youth. The others, Valor, Hope, Justice, and Mercy, names Liam had given them through his drawings because their microchips had only shown numbers, not identities, were gaining weight, their coats growing shiny, their eyes losing that haunted look that spoke of suffering too deep for words. But they were also becoming targets. Webb wanted them dead, wanted to eliminate the evidence of his cruelty, wanted to silence the witnesses who couldn't testify in court, but whose very existence condemned him. He posted their location online, offered money to anyone who would take care of the problem. The clinic had to hire private security, had to install cameras and alarms, had to become a fortress instead of a place of healing. And still, the threats came. A man tried to break into the clinic at 3 a.m., was caught on camera attempting to jimmy the back door. Another man called in a fake emergency, trying to lure Dr. Okonkwo away from the building. The FBI said they were building a case, said they were close to arrests, said justice was coming. But justice was slow, and danger was immediate. Sarah faced an impossible choice. The FBI offered witness protection, new names, new city, new life. They'd be safe, but Liam would lose everything familiar, his school, his routine, his grandmother who lived 2 blocks away and was the only family they had left after the divorce. And most importantly, he'd lose the dogs. Witness protection meant disappearing completely. And you couldn't take 7 German shepherds into hiding. They'd have to be rehomed, separated, sent to different families across different states to prevent Webb from finding them. The bond Liam had formed with them, the bond that had saved their lives, that was healing both them and him, would be severed. He would lose the only beings who had made him feel understood since his father left. Or they could stay, could testify, could help the FBI build their case, could ensure that Webb and everyone involved in his operation went to prison for a very long time. But staying meant danger, meant living with the constant threat of violence, meant putting Liam in harm's way, meant choosing justice for dogs over safety for her son. Sarah sat in their apartment at midnight, watching Liam sleep, trying to make a decision that felt impossible. Her phone rang. Dr. Okonkwo, her voice tight with urgency. "You need to come to the clinic. Now. Duke is crashing again, and Sarah, they're all crashing. All 7 of them. Their vitals are deteriorating. They won't eat. They're not responding to treatment. I think," her voice broke, "I think they know. I think they can sense that Liam might be taken away, and they're giving up. Sarah, they're dying. They're choosing to die rather than lose him." Sarah made a decision in that moment that would change everything. She woke Liam gently, dressed him in the dark, and drove to the clinic. She didn't call the FBI. She didn't call the police. She just went, because her son's face when she told him the dogs were sick was more than she could bear. The fear, the determination, the absolute certainty that he could save them if she would just let him try. They arrived at the clinic at 1:15 a.m. to find chaos. All 7 dogs in acute distress, their vitals crashing. Dr. Okonkwo and her night staff working frantically to stabilize them. But nothing was working. It was as if the dogs had collectively decided that life without Liam wasn't worth living, that the bond they'd formed was more important than survival, that death together was preferable to life apart. Liam ran into the clinic, his small feet slapping on the tile, and the change was immediate. Duchess lifted her head, her tail wagging weakly. Duke's heart rate, which had been dangerously erratic, steadied. Scout, who had been whimpering continuously, went quiet. The other 4 dogs, who had been lying motionless in their crates, stirred, their eyes opening, their attention focusing on the small boy who had just entered the room. Liam went to each dog, his small hands gentle, his humming filling the space with that pattern that seemed to bypass logic and speak directly to something deeper. "I'm here," he whispered to each one. "I'm not leaving. They want me to go away, want me to be safe, but I'm not going. I'm staying with you, all of you, forever." And as he spoke, as he touched them, as he poured his certainty into them, through whatever mysterious channel connected his consciousness to theirs, they rallied, vitals stabilized, breathing eased. The crisis passed. Dr. Okonkwo watched this with tears streaming down her face. "They're connected to him," she said to Sarah, her voice filled with wonder and grief. "Not just emotionally, physiologically, their survival is tied to his presence. Separation isn't just traumatic for them, it's fatal. Sarah, you can't take him into witness protection. You can't separate him from these dogs. It would kill them, and I think—" She paused, chose her words carefully. "I think it might kill him too, not physically, but emotionally. This bond, whatever it is, it's the first thing that's made him want to speak again, want to engage with the world again. Taking it away would be like taking away the one thing that makes him feel whole." Sarah knew Dr. Okonkwo was right. She'd seen the change in Liam over the past 3 days. The way he smiled now, the way he spoke in full sentences, the way he seemed to inhabit his body differently, more fully, more confidently. The dogs had saved him just as much as he'd saved them. They were mirrors, reflecting each other's healing, each other's growth, each other's transformation from broken to whole. She called the FBI agent handling their case, a woman named Sandra Martinez, who had been kind and patient and understanding. "We're not going into protection," Sarah said without preamble. "We're staying, we're testifying, and we're keeping the dogs, all 7 of them. I don't care about the danger. I don't care about the threats. My son saved these dogs, and they saved him. And I'm not going to be the person who breaks that bond. So you figure out how to keep us safe here, or we do this without you. But we're not running." Martinez was quiet for a long moment. "You understand what you're risking? Webb is dangerous. His operation involves violent criminals. The threats against you are credible. If something happens to Liam—" Sarah cut her off. "If something happens to Liam, it will be because I chose his safety over his soul, and I can't do that. I won't do that. He's been dying slowly for 6 months, ever since his father left. These dogs brought him back to life. I'm not taking that away from him. So either help us or get out of our way." Martinez sighed, but there was something like respect in her voice when she spoke again. Okay. We'll increase security. We'll put surveillance on Webb and his associates. We'll move up the timeline on arrests. But Sarah, you need to be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better. Webb isn't going to give up. He's going to escalate. And when he does, you need to be ready." She was right. Webb escalated. 2 days later, at 3 a.m., a van pulled up outside Dr. Okonkwo's clinic. 2 men got out, both armed, both with clear intent to break in and solve the problem that was preventing Webb from escaping justice. But Duchess heard them before they reached the door. Despite her healing leg, despite her injuries, she began barking. Deep, aggressive, territorial barks that woke Dr. Okonkwo in her apartment above the clinic and brought her running downstairs with her phone already dialing 911. The other 6 dogs joined in, 7 German shepherds creating a wall of sound that shattered the 3 a.m. silence and brought neighbors to their windows, lights flicking on up and down the street. The men fled before police arrived, but security footage captured their faces, their license plate, their weapons. The FBI arrested them 6 hours later, and they gave up Webb's location within minutes of interrogation. Marcus Webb Jr. was arrested at a rural property 40 miles outside the city, a property that contained evidence of his entire operation, breeding records, financial documents, communications with dog fighting rings in Nevada, Arizona, and Texas. The FBI also found 8 more German shepherds on the property, all in various states of neglect, all destined for the same fate as the 7 Liam had saved. But Webb wasn't finished. He made bail again, his lawyer arguing that he was a flight risk but not a violent offender, that the charges were animal cruelty and racketeering, not assault or murder. The judge incredibly agreed. Webb walked out of jail at 4 p.m., and by 6 p.m. he had posted Sarah's home address online with a message that made her blood run cold. $10,000 to anyone who teaches this bitch and her freak kid a lesson they'll never forget. The FBI moved them that night, not into witness protection, but into a safe house, a nondescript apartment in a secure building with 24/7 surveillance and armed guards. They could bring the dogs, Martinez said, but only because she'd pulled strings and called in favors and argued that separating Liam from the dogs would compromise his ability to testify. The dogs were evidence, she argued. They were witnesses in their own way. And the child's connection to them was documented, validated by multiple professionals, undeniable in its reality and its importance to the case. But Liam hated the safe house. He hated the locked doors and the guards and the sense of being trapped, of being hidden away like he'd done something wrong. He hated that he couldn't go to school, couldn't see his grandmother, couldn't live his life, because some bad man wanted to hurt him for saving dogs who'd done nothing wrong, except be gentle in a world that rewarded violence. He drew constantly, pictures of himself and the 7 dogs running free, playing in parks, living in a house with a big yard and no locks, no guards, no fear. And the dogs hated it too. They could sense Liam's distress, could feel his fear and frustration and anger. They became restless, pacing, whining, their healing progress stalling. Duke, who had been doing so well, started refusing food again. Duchess's leg, which had been healing beautifully, started showing signs of stress. She was favoring it more, limping more, as if her body was responding to emotional trauma by manifesting physical symptoms. Dr. Okonkwo visited daily, monitoring their progress, growing increasingly concerned. They need stability, she told Sarah. They need routine, normalcy, safety. This limbo, this constant state of alert, it's killing them slowly. We saved their bodies, but we're losing their spirits. On day 12 of their confinement in the safe house, Duke crashed again. His internal bleeding resumed, something Dr. Okonkwo said was medically impossible, that healed hemorrhages don't spontaneously restart, that this defied everything she understood about physiology. But it was happening nonetheless. Duke was dying again, his body giving up. And this time, it felt different. It felt final. It felt like he'd fought as hard as he could, had held on as long as possible. But the constant stress, the constant fear, the constant sense of being trapped was too much. He was choosing to let go. Sarah made an agonizing decision. She called Martinez, told her they were leaving the safe house, going back to the clinic where Duke could receive proper medical care. Martinez argued, warned, threatened, but Sarah was unmovable. "My son's connection to these dogs is keeping them alive," she said flatly. "But the stress of this situation is killing them anyway. So we're leaving. We're going back to the clinic. And if Webb wants to come after us, then he comes after us. But we're not hiding anymore. We're not living in fear anymore. We're done." They left the safe house at 11 p.m. against FBI advice, against every protocol and safety measure Martinez had put in place. They drove to the clinic with a police escort, arrived to find Dr. Okonkwo waiting, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Duke was in critical condition, his blood pressure dropping, his heart rate erratic, his breathing shallow and labored. Dr. Okonkwo had him on every medication, every intervention she could think of, but nothing was working. "I don't know what else to do," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I've tried everything. He's just giving up." Liam ran to Duke's crate, dropped to his knees beside it, his small face pressed against the bars. "Don't go," he whispered, his small voice desperate. "Please don't go. I need you. We all need you. You're the brave one, the one who came back from the dark. You can't go back there now. You can't leave us." But Duke's eyes were glazing, his breathing slowing, his body surrendering to death for the second time. And then Liam did something he'd never done before. He opened the crate, crawled inside, despite Dr. Okonkwo's protests about sterile protocol and infection risk, and lay down beside Duke. He wrapped his small arms around the dog's chest, pressed his small face against Duke's neck, and began to hum. That pattern, that song, but different now, deeper, more urgent, more desperate. It was the sound of a soul refusing to let go, of a connection too strong to be broken by something as mundane as death. The other 6 dogs responded immediately. They left their crates, some walking, some limping, Duchess dragging her healing leg, and converged on Duke's crate. They pressed against the bars, their noses touching Duke through the gaps, their own humming joining Liam's, creating a chorus that filled the clinic with sound that was both animal and human, both primitive and profound. 7 dogs and 1 small boy, all connected, all refusing to let one of their packs slip away into darkness. Duke's heart, which had been failing, steadied. His breathing, which had been shallow, deepened. His eyes, which had been glazing, focused. He looked at Liam, at the small boy who had saved him once and was saving him again. And something passed between them. A promise, maybe, or a vow. "I'll stay," his eyes seemed to say. "I'll fight, I'll live. Because you need me, and I need you. And this bond is stronger than death." Dr. Okonkwo checked his vitals, her hands shaking, her professional composure completely shattered. "The bleeding stopped," she whispered. "Again. It just stopped. This is impossible. This is medically, scientifically, logically impossible. But it's happening. He's stabilizing. She looked at Liam, at his small body still wrapped around Duke, at the other 6 dogs still pressed against the crate, and she saw something that would change her understanding of medicine, of healing, of the boundaries between possible and impossible. "They're a pack," she said softly. "Not just dogs and boy. They're a pack, and the pack doesn't let its members die alone. The pack fights for every life. The pack refuses to surrender." But even as Duke stabilized, even as crisis was averted once again, danger was closing in. Webb had tracked them to the clinic. His brother Daniel had access to police communications, knew about the safe house departure, knew where they'd gone. At 11:47 p.m., the same moment Duke's heart had stopped the first time he'd died, Webb's truck appeared in the clinic parking lot. He sat there, engine running, watching the building, his phone in his hand. He was live streaming, Sarah would learn later, broadcasting to his followers, to the people who believed his version of events, that he was the victim, that his business had been destroyed by lies, that the freak kid and his devil dogs were the real criminals. "They're in there," Webb said to his phone, to his audience, to the mob he was deliberately inciting. "The kid who ruined my life, the dogs who should have died, they're in there right now, and the police can't protect them forever. Justice is coming, real justice. Not the fake justice of courts and lawyers and people who care more about animals than humans. Real justice." He ended the stream, put his phone away, and reached for something on the passenger seat. A gun, security footage would later reveal. He was going to do it himself, was going to end this personally, was going to silence the witnesses and eliminate the evidence and escape to Mexico before anyone could stop him. But he didn't account for Duchess. She heard the truck, heard Webb's voice through the open window, and something in her recognized him. Not his face, not his scent, but something deeper. The energy of cruelty, the signature of the person who had hurt her and her pack. She began barking, that deep, aggressive, territorial bark that had saved them once before. The other 6 dogs joined in immediately, creating a wall of sound that brought Dr. Okonkwo running, that activated the clinic's alarm system, that alerted the FBI agents who had been monitoring the area, despite Sarah's departure from the safe house. Webb saw the agents approaching, saw his window closing, and made a desperate decision. He accelerated toward the clinic entrance, intending to ram through the glass doors to get inside before. He could be stopped, but Duchess was already there, already positioned between the doors and the treatment area where Liam and the other dogs waited. She stood on her healing leg, pain be damned, and she didn't move. She planted herself like a wall, like a promise, like everything that stood between innocence and evil. The truck hit the doors at 40 miles per hour. Glass exploded inward. Metal frame buckled. Duchess was thrown backward, her body hitting the reception desk with a sound that made Sarah scream. But she got up, bleeding, limping worse than ever, possibly with new fractures from the impact. She got up, and she positioned herself between Webb's truck and the treatment area again, between danger and the boy who had saved her, between evil and innocence, between death and life. Webb got out of the truck, gun in hand, his face twisted with rage and desperation. He raised the weapon, aimed at Duchess, his finger tightening on the trigger. And that's when the other 6 dogs attacked. Not to kill, they weren't trained to kill, weren't aggressive by nature, had been bred to be gentle, but they were protective. They were pack, and their pack was threatened. They moved in perfect synchronization, a coordination that shouldn't have been possible for dogs who had only known each other for 12 days, who had never trained together, who had no reason to know how to fight as a unit. But they did. Valor went for Webb's gun hand, his jaws closing around the wrist with enough force to make Webb drop the weapon. Hope and Justice went for his legs, knocking him off balance. Mercy positioned herself in front of Liam, who had emerged from the treatment area, his small face pale with terror. Scout, the puppy, did something that would later seem almost comical in its incongruity. He grabbed Webb's phone, which had fallen from his pocket, and ran with it, taking away Webb's ability to call for help or livestream his attack. And Duke, who had been dying minutes before, who should have been too weak to stand much less fight, placed himself beside Duchess. 2 dogs who had survived impossible odds, who had been saved by a small boy's gift, who had been given a second chance at life, standing together against the person who had tried to take that chance away. The FBI agents arrived within seconds, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Webb was on the ground, surrounded by German shepherds who held him without hurting him, who showed a restraint that was remarkable given what he'd done to them. The agents cuffed him, read him his rights, dragged him away while he screamed about devil dogs and freak kids and injustice. The raid team that had been standing by executed warrants simultaneously at Webb's warehouse, at his brother's house, at the homes of 8 associates who had been identified through the investigation. By dawn, 43 people were in custody, and 62 more dogs had been rescued from conditions that made Sarah weep when she saw the photos. But in the clinic, in the wreckage of the shattered entrance, Sarah held her son and watched Dr. Okonkwo examine the dogs. Duchess had a cracked rib from the impact, would need more surgery, more recovery time, but she was alive. They were all alive. 7 dogs who should have died in a collapsed bounce house, who should have died from their injuries, who should have died from the stress and the threats and the constant danger, were alive, and they were heroes. They had protected the boy who had saved them. They had completed the circle, had proven that salvation flows both ways, that the saved become the saviors, that love is always, always worth the risk. The media coverage the next day was unprecedented. The security footage of the dogs protecting Liam went viral within hours. 20 million views by noon, 50 million by evening. News outlets around the world ran the story. Dog saved by psychic child. Protect him from attacker. The footage of Duchess standing on her broken leg, positioning herself between Webb's truck and Liam, became iconic. A symbol of loyalty, of courage, of the bond between humans and animals that transcends species and logic and everything we think we understand about the world. Dr. Raymond Torres published his findings in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. Interspecies empathic connection in autism spectrum disorder, a case study of shared consciousness between human child and canine pack. The paper documented everything, the tests, the measurements, the statistical impossibility of Liam's accurate identification of which dog was being touched and where, the medical records showing the correlation between Liam's presence and the dog's vital signs, the testimony of multiple witnesses who had observed the connection, who had seen things that defied explanation. The scientific community was divided. Some called it groundbreaking, evidence of consciousness and connection that exceeded current understanding. Others called it confirmation bias, pattern recognition, coincidence dressed up as miracle. But no one could explain how Liam had known the dogs were in the bounce house. No one could explain how he'd drawn their exact markings before seeing them. No one could explain how his presence stabilized their vitals, how his touch brought Duke back from clinical death, how his voice calmed them when nothing else could. The trial was swift. Webb's lawyer tried to argue mental illness, tried to claim his client was a victim of circumstance, tried to paint the dog breeding operation as legitimate business that had gotten out of hand. But the evidence was overwhelming, the testimony was damning, and the footage of Webb attempting to murder a 3-year-old child and 7 dogs who couldn't fight back destroyed any sympathy the jury might have had. He was convicted on 47 counts: animal cruelty, racketeering, attempted murder, conspiracy, weapons charges. The judge sentenced him to 23 years in federal prison. His brother Daniel got 12 years for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The 8 associates got sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. 129 dogs total were rescued from the operation. Most were German Shepherds, but there were also Pit Bulls, Rottweilers, Dobermans, breeds that had been bred for aggression, for fighting, for violence. They were rehabilitated, slowly and carefully, by rescue organizations across 5 states. Some were too damaged, too aggressive, too traumatized to ever trust humans again. They were euthanized humanely, their suffering finally ended. But most survived, most healed. Most found homes with people who understood their history, who had patience for their fears, who could see past the scars to the gentle souls underneath. And the 7 dogs Liam had saved, they stayed together. Sarah officially adopted all 7, an unprecedented decision that required special permits, home modifications, and Dr. Okonkwo's medical testimony that separating them would be harmful to both the dogs and the child. They moved to a house outside the city, a place with a big yard and no neighbors close enough to complain about barking, no landlord to enforce pet restrictions, no limits on the pack that had formed in darkness and been forged in survival. The transformation over the following months was remarkable. Dr. Okonkwo documented it all, took photos every week, tracked weight gain and behavioral changes, and the gradual shift from traumatized survivors to healthy, happy dogs. Duchess's leg healed completely. No limp, no weakness, full range of motion that Dr. Okonkwo said was frankly miraculous, given the severity of the initial injury. Duke's internal organs showed no signs of the damage that should have been permanent. Scout grew into his oversized puppy paws, became a gangly adolescent who played with the tireless energy of youth. Valor, hope, justice, and mercy, the 4 who had been the quietest, the most withdrawn, began to show their individual personalities. Valor was the clown, always trying to make the others play. Hope was the gentle one, the first to comfort any pack member in distress. Justice was the watchdog, always alert, always protective. Mercy was the cuddler, the one who needed physical contact constantly, who would press against Liam's legs whenever he sat down. And Liam bloomed. That's the only word Sarah could use to describe it. He went from selective mute to chatterbox, talking constantly, asking questions, telling stories, narrating his drawings with elaborate explanations. He returned to preschool with Duchess as his service dog, a designation Dr. Torres had helped arrange, documenting Liam's need for her presence to manage his anxiety and trauma responses. The other children were fascinated by Duchess, by her scars and her story, and her obvious devotion to Liam. Teachers reported that Liam was more engaged, more confident, more willing to participate in activities he'd avoided before. But the most remarkable change was in Liam's gift. It didn't disappear. If anything, it grew stronger, more refined, more controlled. He began drawing animals in distress, strays, injured wildlife, pets trapped in cars or abandoned in empty houses. Sarah would take him to investigate, and every single time, they found exactly what he'd drawn: a cat with a broken leg hiding under a porch 3 blocks away, a dog locked in a hot car in a grocery store parking lot, a family of raccoons trapped in an attic, the mother injured, the babies crying. They rescued 37 animals over the next 18 months. Sarah kept count, kept records, kept documentation that Dr. Torres added to his research. Each rescue followed the same pattern. Liam would draw the animal, describe its location with impossible accuracy, and they would find it exactly where he said it would be. The local animal control started calling Sarah when they had difficult cases, animals they couldn't locate, situations that seemed hopeless. Liam would draw, and they would find. Every single time, the 7 dogs became therapy animals. Dr. Okonkwo helped with the certification, and soon they were visiting St. Catherine's Children's Hospital every Tuesday. Duchess specialized in PTSD cases, children who had been traumatized, who couldn't speak about their experiences, who needed the kind of nonverbal understanding that only someone who had survived trauma could provide. Duke worked with children who had lost parents, whose grief was too big for words. Scout, despite his youth, had a gift for pediatric oncology. Somehow, the puppy knew which children needed comfort most, which ones were sickest, Which ones needed the distraction of play versus the comfort of quiet presence? Valor, hope, justice, and mercy worked as a team with autistic children, providing the kind of sensory input and emotional regulation that traditional therapy sometimes missed. They were patient with meltdowns, gentle with sensory sensitivities, intuitive about when to engage and when to simply be present. The hospital staff called them miracle workers. Parents cried when they saw their non-verbal children speak for the first time while petting Duchess, when they watched their traumatized children smile while playing with Scout, when they witnessed their autistic children find peace in the presence of dogs who understood what it meant to be different, to be misunderstood, to be dismissed by a world that didn't know how to see past the surface to the soul underneath. Dr. Torres continued his research, published follow-up papers, gave lectures at universities about consciousness and connection, and the boundaries between species that might be more permeable than science currently acknowledged. He brought other researchers to observe Liam, to document his abilities, to try to understand the mechanism behind his gift. Brain scans showed unusual activity in regions associated with empathy and sensory processing. Genetic testing revealed nothing remarkable. It was as if Liam's gift existed in a space that current science couldn't measure, couldn't quantify, couldn't reduce to neurons and chemicals and biological processes. Maybe that's the point, Dr. Torres said during one of his visits, watching Liam play with the 7 dogs in the backyard, watching the way they moved around him like planets around a sun, like they were all part of one organism instead of 8 separate beings. Maybe some things aren't meant to be explained. Maybe some connections are too profound, too fundamental, too sacred to be reduced to data and measurements. Maybe we're asking the wrong questions. Instead of asking how he does it, maybe we should be asking why. Why him? Why these dogs? Why this moment? Sarah thought she knew the answer, though she'd never said it out loud, never tried to articulate it even to herself. Liam had been broken by his father's abandonment, shattered by the loss of the person who was supposed to stay forever, who was supposed to love unconditionally, who was supposed to prove that promises meant something. And the 7 dogs had been broken by human cruelty, by the deliberate infliction of suffering, by the casual dismissal of their worth and their lives. They were mirrors, reflecting each other's wounds, each other's pain, each other's desperate need to believe that broken things could be fixed, that abandoned things could be found, that suffering could be transformed into something beautiful. They saved each other. It was that simple and that profound. Liam saved them from death in a collapsed bounce house, from suffering in a warehouse of horrors, from a world that had decided they didn't matter. And they saved him from silence, from the prison of trauma, from the belief that love always leaves and promises always break. They proved to each other that some bonds are stronger than fear, that some connections transcend the boundaries of species and language and everything that tries to keep us separate and alone. 18 months after the rescue, on a Saturday morning that felt like the echo of that first Saturday when everything changed, Sarah drove Liam and the 7 dogs to Riverside Park. The bounce house company had gone out of business. Lawsuits and criminal charges and public outrage had destroyed them within weeks of the incident. But the park remained, and the community had erected a memorial where the bounce house had stood. 7 stones, 1 for each dog, arranged in a circle around a plaque that read, "In memory of innocence protected, courage rewarded, and the unbreakable bond between a boy and his pack. May we all learn to hear the voices that others dismiss, to believe in the impossible, to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves." Liam stood in the center of the stone circle, surrounded by his dogs, and he spoke to the small crowd that had gathered, reporters, rescue workers, families whose children had been helped by the therapy dogs, people who had followed the story and wanted to be part of the celebration. His small voice was clear and certain, no trace of the selective mutism that had once imprisoned him. "I used to be really sad," he said, his small hand resting on Duchess's head. "I used to think that when people leave, it means you weren't good enough to make them stay. I used to think that being different meant being wrong. But these dogs taught me something different. They taught me that being different is what made me able to hear them. They taught me that broken things can be the strongest things. They taught me that love doesn't leave, not real love. Real love stays, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when the whole world says to give up." He paused, looked at each dog in turn, his small face serious. "Duchess taught me to be brave even when you're scared. Duke taught me that you can come back from the dark if someone's waiting for you in the light. Scout taught me that being young doesn't mean you can't be strong. Valor taught me that it's okay to be silly, to play, to find joy even after terrible things. Hope taught me that gentleness is a superpower. Justice taught me that protecting others is the most important job in the world. And mercy taught me that everybody needs somebody to hold on to when the world gets too big and too scary. The crowd was silent, many wiping tears, watching this small boy who had somehow become a symbol of everything good that could emerge from darkness, everything beautiful that could be built from brokenness. Liam looked at his mother, and she nodded, encouraging. "I want to tell you something important," he continued, his small voice growing stronger. "If you see something suffering, animal or human, don't look away. Listen, really listen, not just with your ears, but with your inside, with the place where feelings live. Because sometimes the most important voices are the ones that don't make sound. Sometimes the people, or the animals, who need help the most, are the ones everyone else ignores because they're too small, or too different, or too broken to matter." He knelt down, wrapped his small arms around Duchess, buried his face in her fur. "They mattered," he whispered, but the microphone caught it, carried it to every person present. "They mattered so much. And if I hadn't listened, if I had let people tell me I was wrong, if I had stopped believing what my inside was telling me, they would have died. And I would have died too, a little bit. The part of me that believes in magic and miracles and impossible things would have died. So, don't let people tell you that what you know isn't real. Don't let them make you stop listening to your inside voice. Because that voice, that quiet, certain voice that tells you someone needs help, that tells you something is wrong, that tells you to keep trying even. When everyone says to give up, that voice is the most important thing you have. That voice is how we save each other." The ceremony ended with the release of 7 doves, one for each dog, symbolic of freedom and survival and the transformation from captivity to flight. Liam watched them soar into the clear blue sky, his small hand shielding his eyes from the sun, and Sarah saw something on his face that made her chest tight with emotion. Peace. Her son, who had been so lost, so silent, so broken, had found peace. Not because his father had come back, he hadn't, and probably never would. Not because the world had become less cruel or less dangerous or less dismissive of small voices, but because he had found his purpose. He had found his pack. He had found proof that love could stay, that promises could be kept, that broken things could heal if they healed together. They spent the afternoon at the park, Liam playing with the dogs, running and laughing, and being the child he'd been before trauma stole his voice. Other families approached cautiously, asking if their children could pet the dogs, could hear their story, could learn about the rescue and the bond and the miracle of survival. Liam told the story 7 times that afternoon, once for each dog, and each telling was slightly different, emphasizing different details, different lessons, different moments of connection. But the core remained the same. He had heard them when no one else could. He had believed when no one else would. And that belief had saved 8 lives, 7 dogs and 1 small boy who needed each other more than they needed safety or logic or the approval of a world that didn't understand what they'd found in each other. As the sun set and the park began to empty, Sarah sat on a bench and watched her son. He was lying in the grass, surrounded by 7 German shepherds, all of them touching him somehow. A paw on his leg, a head on his chest, a body pressed against his side. They looked like a Renaissance painting, she thought, like something sacred and ancient and infinitely precious. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Torres. "I'm writing a book about Liam and the dogs, about consciousness and connection, and the science of impossible things. Will you participate?" Sarah looked at her son, at his small face tilted toward the sky, at the dogs who had saved him just as much as he'd saved them, and she typed her response. "Yes, but only if you tell the truth, that some things can't be explained, only experienced, that some bonds are too profound for science, too sacred for skepticism, that sometimes the most important discoveries aren't the ones we can measure, but the ones we can only witness and wonder at." 3 years after the rescue, Liam was 6 years old and starting 1st grade. Duchess went with him every day, her service dog Vest, marking her as essential, her presence providing the stability and comfort that allowed Liam to navigate the social complexities of school. The other 6 dogs had their own routines now. Therapy visits, training sessions, lazy afternoons in the backyard, and occasional adventures when Liam drew an animal that needed help, and they all piled into Sarah's van to go investigate. The house they lived in was chaos most of the time. 7 large dogs meant constant noise, constant motion, constant dog hair on every surface. But it was also filled with love, with laughter, with the kind of joy that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be, with exactly who you're supposed to be with. Sarah had quit her office job and started a nonprofit, Liam's Legacy, that trained rescue dogs to work with traumatized children, that taught people to listen to animals in distress, that funded research into animal-human bonding and the therapeutic potential of that connection. The nonprofit had rescued and rehomed 47 dogs in 3 years, had provided therapy services to over 200 children, had become a model for similar programs in 8 states. Sarah gave talks at conferences, wrote grants, managed volunteers, and somehow found time to be a mother to a son who was extraordinary in every sense of the word. Liam's gift hadn't faded with time. If anything, it had grown more refined, more controlled. He could now sense animals in distress within a 2-mile radius, could draw their locations with GPS-level accuracy, could communicate with them in ways that continued to baffle scientists and delight everyone who witnessed it. But he was also just a 6-year-old boy. He played video games and complained about homework and got in arguments with other kids about whose turn it was on the swings. He was normal and extraordinary all at once, a reminder that gifts don't make you less human, that being different doesn't mean being alien, that the same child who could communicate with animals through some mysterious, empathic connection could also throw tantrums about bedtime and negotiate for extra dessert. The 7 dogs were his constant companions, his protectors, his family. They slept in his room, all 7 of them, somehow fitting into a space that seemed too small, arranging themselves around his bed like guards, like promises, like proof that some bonds are unbreakable. They walked him to the bus stop every morning, waited in the yard for his return every afternoon, celebrated his victories, and comforted his defeats with the unwavering loyalty that only dogs can provide. And they were happy. That was the most important thing, the detail that Sarah returned to whenever she felt overwhelmed by the chaos or the responsibility or the weight of raising a child who was both ordinary and extraordinary. The dogs were happy. Their eyes were bright. Their tails wagged constantly. Their bodies were healthy and strong and showed no signs of the trauma they had endured. They played with the abandon of puppies, slept with the peace of creatures who felt safe, loved with the intensity of souls who knew what it meant to be saved, and were determined to spend the rest of their lives being worthy of that salvation. On a quiet evening in late fall, Sarah found Liam in the backyard, sitting in the grass with all 7 dogs arranged around him. He was drawing again, always drawing, his gift manifesting in art before it manifested in action. But this time, he wasn't drawing an animal in distress. He was drawing a memory. The bounce house collapse. The rescue. The moment when he'd first touched Duchess's nose through the torn vinyl and felt the connection that would change both their lives. "Why are you drawing that?" Sarah asked gently, sitting beside him in the grass, feeling the warm weight of Hope's head settling onto her lap. Liam was quiet for a long moment, his small hand moving across the paper with careful precision. "Because I don't want to forget," he said finally, his voice soft but certain. "I don't want to forget what it felt like to be scared and sad and alone. Because if I forget, I might stop listening for other people who feel that way. I might stop hearing the voices that need to be heard." He added more details to his drawing, the 7 dogs, their eyes, their expressions, the way they'd looked at him with hope and fear and desperate trust all mixed together. "They were so brave," he whispered. "They were trapped and hurt and dying, but they were still brave. They didn't give up. They kept hoping that someone would come, even when there was no reason to hope. And I want to be like that. I want to be brave even when I'm scared. I want to keep hoping even when things seem impossible. I want to believe in miracles because I've seen them happen." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came from loving someone so much it physically hurt. "You are like that," she told her son, her voice thick with emotion. "You're the bravest person I know. You heard them when no one else could. You believed when no one else would. You saved them, and they saved you. and together you've saved so many others. That's not just brave, Liam. That's extraordinary. Liam looked up at her, his dark eyes ancient and knowing in his still young face. But it's not just me, he said seriously. It's us. All of us together. Me and Duchess and Duke and Scout and Valor and Hope and Justice and Mercy. We're a pack. And packs take care of each other. Packs don't let anyone get left behind. Packs listen to the quiet voices and believe in impossible things and fight for people who can't fight for themselves. That's what we do. That's who we are. He returned to his drawing, adding one final detail. Himself, small and determined, standing in the center of the 7 dogs, connected to them by lines that might have been leashes or might have been something deeper, something invisible, something that transcended physical connection and existed in the realm of soul and spirit and bonds that death itself couldn't break. Sarah watched her son draw, watched the 7 dogs watch him with expressions of devotion that never failed to move her, and she thought about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. A collapsed bounce house, a 3-year-old's certainty, 7 dogs who should have died but didn't, a connection that defied explanation but demanded recognition, a family built from brokenness, forged in survival, strengthened by love that refused to be limited by species or logic or the boundaries that tried to keep souls separate. She thought about Marcus Webb, rotting in a federal prison, his empire of cruelty dismantled, his name synonymous with evil. She thought about the 129 dogs who had been rescued, the lives that had been saved, the suffering that had been ended. She thought about the children who had been helped by the therapy dogs, the families who had been healed by witnessing impossible bonds, the shift in consciousness that was happening slowly but surely as more people learned to listen to the voices they had been taught to dismiss. And she thought about her son, who had been so lost, so silent, so convinced that love always leaves and promises always break, who had found 7 reasons to believe again, 7 proofs that broken things can heal, 7 souls who needed him as much as he needed them, who had transformed from victim to hero, from silent to vocal, from broken to whole, not despite his trauma, but because of it. Because his pain had taught him to recognize pain in others. Because his abandonment had made him sensitive to the abandoned. Because his brokenness had given him the ability to see beauty in other broken things. As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the clear autumn sky, Sarah called Liam inside for dinner. He gathered his drawings, kissed each dog goodnight, a ritual that took several minutes because he insisted on individual attention for each one, and followed his mother into the house. The dogs settled into their evening positions, some on the porch, some in the yard, all within sight of the house, all keeping watch over the family they'd chosen and who had chosen them back. Inside, over dinner, Liam talked about his day at school, about the new girl who didn't speak English yet, and how he'd helped her find the bathroom and shared his lunch with her because he remembered what it felt like to be new and scared and unable to communicate. He talked about the math test he'd aced and the book he was reading and the drawing he was planning for art class tomorrow. He was normal and extraordinary, ordinary and miraculous, a 6-year-old boy who happened to have abilities that science couldn't explain, but that anyone who witnessed them couldn't deny. After dinner, after bath time, after the bedtime routine that involved reading stories and checking under the bed for monsters and making sure all 7 dogs were accounted for and comfortable, Sarah tucked Liam into bed. She sat on the edge of his mattress, surrounded by German shepherds who had arranged themselves around the room like guards, and she asked the question she asked every night. "What are you grateful for today?" Liam thought about it, his small face serious in the dim light from his nightlight. "I'm grateful for my pack," he said finally. "For Duchess and Duke and Scout and Valor and Hope and Justice and Mercy. For you, for Dr. Okonkwo and Dr. Torres and Detective Martinez. For everyone who believed me when I said the dogs were there, even when it didn't make sense. For everyone who helped save them. For everyone who helps save anyone who needs saving." He paused, his small hand reaching out to touch Duchess, who was lying beside his bed, her amber eyes watching him with devotion that never wavered. "But mostly I'm grateful that I can hear them, the animals who need help, the people who are scared and alone, the quiet voices that everyone else misses. Because if I couldn't hear them, they might stay lost. And nobody should stay lost. Nobody should be alone in the dark. Everyone should have someone who hears them, who believes them, who comes to find them no matter what. Sarah kissed her son's forehead, felt tears on her cheeks that she didn't bother to wipe away. "You're right," she whispered. "Everyone should have that. And because of you, because of your gift, because of your refusal to stop listening, more people do. More animals do. You're making the world better, Liam. One rescue at a time, one voice at a time, one impossible miracle at a time." She turned off the light, left the door open a crack the way Liam liked it, and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the sounds of her house. 7 dogs breathing in rhythm, her son humming softly, that pattern that had saved 7 lives and changed countless others. The ordinary sounds of a family settling in for the night, of safety and comfort and love that stayed instead of leaving. And Sarah thought about the question Dr. Torres had asked months ago. Why him? Why these dogs? Why this moment? She thought she understood now, because the world needed proof that broken things could heal, because children needed to know that being different was a gift, not a curse, because animals needed advocates who could hear them, who could speak for them, who could fight for them when they couldn't fight for themselves, because everyone, human and animal alike, needed to believe in miracles, in impossible connections, in bonds that transcended logic and lived in the realm of soul and spirit and love that refused to be contained by the boundaries that tried to keep us separate. Liam Chen, 3 years old when he heard 7 dogs trapped in a collapsed bounce house, had become a symbol of all of that, a reminder that the smallest voices sometimes carry the most important messages, that the most broken souls sometimes have the greatest capacity for healing. That love, real love, the kind that stays and fights and refuses to give up, can transform tragedy into triumph, suffering into purpose, darkness into light. The 7 dogs who should have died but didn't, who were saved by a boy who needed saving just as much as they did, had become ambassadors of that truth. They visited hospitals and schools and therapy centers, bringing comfort and joy and proof that survival was possible, that healing was real, that broken things could become beautiful again. They were living testaments to the power of connection, to the reality of bonds that science couldn't measure, but that anyone with eyes could see, with hearts could feel. And together, boy and dogs, child and pack, broken souls who had found each other in darkness and chosen to walk toward light together. They were changing the world, one rescue at a time, one child at a time, one moment of impossible connection at a time. Because that's what miracles do. They don't just change the people directly involved. They ripple outward, touching everyone who witnesses them, everyone who hears about them, everyone who allows themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world is more magical than we've been taught to believe, that maybe consciousness is more connected than we've been told, that maybe the boundaries between human and animal, between self and other, between possible and impossible, are more permeable than science currently acknowledges. Liam's story, the story of a boy who heard what others couldn't, who believed what others wouldn't, who saved 7 lives and was saved in return, became a touchstone for people around the world. Parents of autistic children reached out, sharing their own stories of unusual sensitivities and impossible knowledge. Animal rescue workers reported increased awareness, more people listening for animals in distress, more willingness to investigate when something felt wrong, even if logic said nothing was there. Researchers began studying animal-human bonding with new seriousness, new openness to possibilities that had previously been dismissed as anthropomorphism or wishful thinking. The 7 dogs lived long, happy lives, longer than their breed's average, healthier than their early trauma suggested possible. Duchess lived to be 14, her amber eyes bright until the very end, her devotion to Liam never wavering. Duke made it to 13, his heart, which had stopped twice and been restarted by a small boy's touch, beating strong until the day it finally, peacefully, stopped for the last time. Scout, the puppy who had died and been revived, lived to be 12, his playful spirit intact until his final day. Valor, hope, justice, and mercy all lived into their teens, each one leaving a legacy of children helped, lives touched, proof that love could heal even the deepest wounds. And when each dog passed, Liam, no longer a small boy but a young man studying veterinary medicine and animal behavior, was there. He held them, hummed that pattern that had connected them from the beginning, and whispered the same words he'd whispered in a collapsed bounce house so many years ago. You're not alone. I'm here. I'll always be here. You're safe. You're loved. You matter. Because that's what the story was really about in the end. Not about supernatural abilities or impossible connections or miracles that defied explanation. It was about mattering, about being seen, being heard, being believed when the world said you were wrong or crazy or making things up. It was about refusing to let anyone, human or animal, suffer alone in darkness when you had the power to bring light. It was about choosing to listen when others chose to dismiss, to believe when others chose to doubt, to fight when others chose to surrender. If this story moved you, if it made you believe in the extraordinary bond between humans and animals, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of courage, compassion, and miraculous rescues that will restore your faith in humanity. And tell us in the comments, what moment touched your heart the most? We read every single comment and would love to hear how this story affected you. Thank you for being part of our community, because we are all part of the same community in the end. Human and animal, young and old, broken and whole, lost and found. We are all connected by invisible threads of consciousness and compassion and the fundamental truth that we need each other, that we save each other, that the smallest among us, a 3-year-old boy, 7 dying dogs, can change the world if we just listen, if we just believe, if we just refuse to walk away from suffering when we have the power to end it. That's the lesson Liam Chen and his 7 German shepherds taught the world. That's the legacy they left behind, and that's why their story matters, why it will continue to matter, why it will be told and retold for generations to come. Because it's not just their story, it's our story. The story of what we could be if we learn to listen to the voices others dismiss, to see the value in what others overlook, to believe in connections that transcend logic and live in the realm of soul and spirit and love that refuses to be contained. Listen, believe, save, be saved. That's the message. That's the miracle. That's the truth that 7 dogs and 1 small boy prove beyond any doubt. We are all worth saving, and we all have the power to save others. We just have to choose to use it. We just have to choose to listen. We just have to choose to believe that broken things can heal, that lost things can be found, that love, real, enduring, transformative love, is always, always worth the risk.